of India as well with me, Frank Razan Pereira. External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar, while addressing the Delhi Dialogue Conference on Saturday, said that one of the problems in building partnerships in the Indo-Pacific maritime region was the lack of consensus on what such a concept meant or even its geographic extent. The Indian Ocean region countries should therefore build on a common vision. Now, they all had the guiding principle of ensuring that the region remained open and free for inclusive partnerships with all within the parameters of sovereignty, equality and a rule-based system. The challenge, however, was that countries to the west of India had fewer mechanisms than those to the east to pursue such ties. While countries like the US define the Indo-Pacific as reaching the Indian subcontinent, India and partners like Japan extend the idea to Africa. Another major challenge is maritime security. Although the conference had participants from India's quadrilateral partners, the US, Australia and Japan, the foreign minister made no mention of the Quad in his address, in line with the government's objective of keeping the Indo-Pacific strategy separate from the Quad alignment. On this edition of India's World, we will analyze India's strategy in the Indian Ocean region. Joining me on the program today are Vice Admiral Satish Soni, retired, former Commander-in-Chief, Eastern Command. Professor Swaran Singh, Chairperson, Centre for International Politics, JNU. And Prabhu Dayal, former Ambassador. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of India's World. Master, I'd like to begin the program with you. Let's first try and understand the concept of the Indian Ocean and the Indian Ocean region as far as India is concerned.
Well, India has made it very clear that it views the Indian Ocean in a holistic manner. Because as you mentioned, the Americans had been viewing the Indo-Pacific as terminating at the Indian subcontinent. But India has made it clear that it wants a more comprehensive view of the Indian Ocean so as to include the western part of the Indian Ocean also. And that is why, very significantly, during the previous week, India hosted not only the 6th Indo-ASEAN dialogue on 13th of December, but also the this Delhi dialogue. First of all, the 6th Indian Ocean dialogue, and then the Delhi dialogue, so as to take a more holistic view of the entire Indian Ocean. Now, let me mention that India has been calling for an Indian Ocean that is mutually beneficial, cooperative, free, inclusive, and has a more openness to it. There are many challenges which are confronting not only India, but all the Indian Ocean countries. Piracy is one of them. The incidents of piracy continue to be very, very large. In 2018, there were more than 200 such incidents. And while the year 2019 has not yet come to a close, there have been a fairly significant number of such incidents. So it's necessary for all the littoral states and all the states in the Indian Ocean region to cooperate. Secondly, there is also this looming presence of China. All the countries are in some way or the other impacted. We are, of course, concerned by China's so-called String of Pearls project, which starts all the way from the Chinese mainland and goes right across to Port Sudan in the Horn of Africa. We are concerned because of the fact that there is a sort of attempt to encircle India. There is, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative. And here in the Indian Ocean region, there are Chinese bases, or the Chinese have access to ports in Myanmar, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan. So it does create a situation where we have to take stock of what's happening. Right. The Chinese are also creating similar unease amidst other countries. They have had serious problems with Vietnam, with Philippines, and also to some extent with Indonesia. So in our own context, there is talk of us also developing similar access and similar bases, and there has been the mention of India's diamond necklace, right, with us having access to ports in Singapore, Vietnam, Indonesia, also in certain parts of Africa, And of course, India has developed its own ports, which the Admiral will be able to speak at greater length about.
Sure.
There is one other very significant aspect, and that is we have been emphasizing connectivity. And connectivity entails a more developed system of ports, better managed, better run ports. Our own ports need upgradation. At the same time, there is a need to remove some of the bottlenecks. The Straits of Malacca, for instance, have a lot of bottlenecks. And there has been a talk for a long time of the Thai Canal. But there have been problems in that regard. The Thais themselves have not been very comfortable. But if that were to happen, then the route would just be past the Andaman Islands, and there would be tremendous opportunities for India. So India is going to be a winner all the way if the flow within the Indian Ocean region is smoothened, is facilitated, and that's what we have been pushing for.
Okay, all right. The key then, Admiral, is free and open Indian Ocean. How free and open is it really in its truest sense?
Well, actually, firstly, what do you mean by free and open? You know, this is a Western concept which is just caught the imagination of everyone in the maritime field. Firstly, free and open means freedom of navigation. It means rule of the law. It means obeying the international conventions. It means lack of coercion. It means free economic trade, etc. And so free and open was a concept which essentially was related to the Indo-Pacific. And now we've started talking about it in the Indian Ocean. Now, in the Indian Ocean, Indian Ocean is an extremely important water body now. It occupies about 20% of the world's water surface, the third largest ocean. And the 51 nations which surround or which form the littoral account for about 25% of the land mass. And 51 countries, have approximately 39% of the world's population. Most of these countries were essentially colonies, and they've just, got independence. Some have done well, some have not done so well. In fact, 10 of the first 20 most fragile countries are in the Indian Ocean littoral. The first 3 are, in fact, Indian littorals. So the challenges which are imposed upon the countries of the Indian Ocean are really enormous. And to be able to adopt a concept like free and open Indo-Pacific, they have to develop capabilities and capacities to improve maritime governance, for which countries like India have to contribute a lot, for which extra-regional countries have to be more sensitive to our concerns, and the emerging powers like China have to be equally sensitive about what they do and how they make their presence felt in the Indian Ocean. Essentially, we need to improve maritime governance so that we can address common non-traditional challenges like human trafficking, climate change, like the damage to the biodiversity. So these are some of the challenges which are facing us and which we must address in order to follow the term free and open Indian Ocean.
Okay, since both panelists have brought up China as well, Professor, I want to take the point of China forward with you. Now, we all know the threat that China poses really on our borders and, the kind of skirmishes that have taken place over the decades. But as far as the Indian Ocean is concerned, is China our biggest challenge?
China is definitely a new challenge. China is a new player in the Indian Ocean. Of course, there are several other challenges one could talk about. But in terms of China's challenge is the fact that it has enormous naval capacity which it is building and is increasingly showcasing in Indian Ocean. Indeed, its focus of 1990s to move towards Pacific Ocean has over time drifted towards moving into Indian Ocean, because Indian Ocean was seen as a territory where certain amount of power vacuum was emerging after Soviet Union retreated, followed by Americans also to some extent retreating. And China became a new important player in the game. And among several other drivers to its expanded presence in the region has been this anti-piracy fights that it has had, especially in Gulf of Aden. And we saw about 2 years ago, it finally set up a naval base in Djibouti. Other than the port facilities, which sometimes people believe have naval access as well, we have seen, for example, Chinese submarines showing up in Sri Lankan ports. So those are port facilities which could have dual use, but at Djibouti, among 5 other nations, China has a naval base today. And that definitely is a clearly security challenge for India to really reckon with. But India has its own advantages as well. China has literally far more distance and complicated waters to cross to showcase its presence and access in Indian Ocean region. India is ordained with a very large coastline with 1,000 plus island territories. And if you look at how in 21st century we are now focusing, in fact the whole world is focusing on blue economy. So if you expand your canvas beyond security focus, you look at entirely life now expanding into oceans from earth, whether it is for food, for water, for livelihood, for leisure, for transport, for dredging minerals. Whole lot of sectors now increasingly depend engaging with oceans, and India has enormous advantage of being actually jetted out into Indian Ocean territory. And I think that is the larger canvas which makes several other nations recognize India's salience in that sense, which could be partly driven by their consciousness as well of China becoming a new naval and maritime player in the region, and that is of concern to them. And the mention of string of pearls was already made, for example. But I think in the larger canvas where India's positive value addition that is attractive to several other nations is where, this is seeing India becoming a very integral part. If you remember, in Asia Pacific, India didn't exist. Now, when you have the same region being viewed from maritime lens, Indo-Pacific, India is increasingly becoming integral and central to that discourse. And there are 3 things very quickly that India has done lately. One, mechanics of dialogue is upgraded. Now it is at foreign ministers level that Quad is talking. And that makes India's unusual link to the Pacific powers of Australia, Japan and United States. India traditionally has had a great connect with the Indian Ocean littoral starting with 1990s, 97 onwards. And what India is today doing is to separate the Quad and Indo-Pacific debate and make sure that India is able to sort of divide that advantage and sort of maximize that advantage through it. To say Indian Ocean engagement then would now include even the Gulf areas. So expanding the territory even of Indo-Pacific where ASEAN is at the center, but also geographically expanding the whole region from Africa, Gulf to Australia and beyond. And finally, of course, the issue of going beyond simply economic relations, social relations, commercial relationship, diaspora, to now increasingly security and maritime axis, nexus or whatever is being built across the littoral by India. And Ambassador just made mention of a series of ports where India has access. We have some of these ports, we are also refurbishing those ports. So when we hear of China's access, I think sometimes we overlook India's access and historical advantages in the region. And that is what need to be underlined repeatedly to say why are those nations interested in engaging India in the Indo-Pacific format.
Sure. Ambassador, talking about nations interested in engaging with India, we've seen, India and France to take it up a notch as far as the Indian Ocean is concerned, especially in the Western Indian Ocean. Of course, the Quad has been spoken about by all the 3 panelists. Your thoughts on, on scaling up the relations with countries like France, who've got a very strong navy, and also the Quad?
Well, I think most countries consider India as a reliable partner and would like to see India also serving the role of a pole. Nobody wants a unipolar Asia, except perhaps the Chinese. The Chinese want to dominate Asia and want to be the only pole, not just in our continent, but perhaps in the rest of the world. Countries like France see India as a viable counterpoise. Now, we do not want to fight anybody's conflicts with the Chinese. And you are right, in the address, the foreign minister didn't speak of the Quad, though our dialogue with the Quad is ongoing, and as Professor Swaran Singh mentioned, it has been upgraded to the foreign minister level. Nonetheless, the important point is that we have to take care of our interests and our security. And if we feel that by entering into some viable partnerships with countries of the region and countries outside the region, our security interests are served, then I'm sure we will be engaging in more and more such partnerships. We already have access to the port in Singapore. We also have access to ports in Indonesia, in Oman. So I think the countries of the region trust us and are prepared to engage with us in a dialogue, not necessarily aimed against China, but certainly aimed at ensuring maritime security in the region, which is our objective also. So I would once again underline the fact that while our pursuit of our interests in the Indian Ocean region is not aggressive, it's not quite the necklace of diamonds which is being called by the media, but nonetheless it is significant that we are also engaging in a dialogue with partners and like-minded countries to see how we can enhance the security of the Indian Ocean region, and create situations where there would be mutual benefit, upgrading our ports, upgrading their ports, working together. I think that is something that we are working towards.
So there are tremendous opportunities really as far as the Indian Ocean region is concerned, is what you're suggesting. But you know, as far as challenges are concerned, Admiral, what are some of them? What are the areas of concern as for India?
You see, every maritime country would face some traditional challenges. Traditional challenges with respect to, you know, your border issues, your maritime boundary issues, etc. But while they may be different, there are these non-traditional challenges which are common to all of us, and they are becoming increasingly important. Now, Indian Ocean has 40% of the oil reserves of the world. 50% of the container traffic passes through the Indian Ocean. Over 120,000 ships transit the Indian Ocean. 2/3 of the oil tankers in the world, they transit through the Indian Ocean. 1/3 of the bulk cargo goes through the Indian Ocean. So in effect, Indian Ocean affects the economy of all countries. Indian Ocean becomes important to everyone. Now, but that poses a lot of challenges, you know, or to the littorals. I spoke about biodiversity, you know, the damage which can cause to the oceans. Merchant ships, when they transit from one port to the other, they often have to ballast and deblast their tanks. And if the tank water is not treated before discharging, it can damage the biodiversity. Increase in temperatures on account of climate change is affecting the oceans a lot. The rise of sea level, they say, is about 3 millimeters a year, or accounts to maybe 20 inches in 100 years. But take for instance Maldives, which has the maximum height of 5 meters, would, you know, according to some statistics, theoretically get submerged after about 100 odd years. And a similar fate would, you know, also be for Bangladesh, where it will lose a lot of land area. Now, this is a challenge which is, you know, common to all of us. Human trafficking is a business for nearly $2 billion. 70,000 to 2 million are human trafficked every year. And where do these people come from? These poor countries of India, Bangladesh, the Rohingyas, Myanmar, and they often find a watery grave. And then you have the challenges of piracy, for example. And all of them, the piracy spoke about, and Somalia, we've experienced from 2008 to 2012, 4 years of intense piracy. Over 165 successful hijacking, resulting in a payment of something like 700 million US dollars. And 120 or 130 international warships are always present in the Gulf of Aden and around to counter this menace. And fortunately, we've been able to get a handle on it. But in our fight against piracy, everyone, whether it is China, Japan, South Korea, Iran, US, UK, everyone was involved because this is a common challenge.
Sure.
Maritime terrorism is going to be another common challenge. Irregulated, unreported fishing. If only we can keep track of who these people are who are exploiting the oceans. The Chinese have already run out of the fish in their waters, and their fishing trawlers are all over the world. So the countries which they profess to help, if they were able to even learn about how they are being exploited. So maritime governance of the Indian Ocean region is essentially the key challenge, and maritime governance is only possible if all of us come together, the rich and the poor alike. We improve our maritime domain awareness, and we are able to tackle these challenges.
Sure. So, Professor, that having been said, what is the idea of the Indian Ocean as far as some of the other major stakeholders are concerned?
I think this idea would emerge from how we come together, and I think just mentioned by Admiral was made about governance challenges. Compared to the Southeast Asian region where ASEAN has been at center and several series of initiatives, networks have been built. In the West, only around Gulf of Aden, there are few networks created of joint patrolling and real-time data sharing, etc. But there are no geopolitical networks that have happened there which could come up to, debating on what do they mean by when they talk of Indian Ocean. IORA has been one of the older ones, but it also leaves out much of the Pacific. So the merger of these two will have to develop a shared common governance mechanism to understand what do we mean by Indo-Pacific and what we want to do about it. Right now, India is trying to segregate Quad and the Indo-Pacific itself. India is also trying to segregate Indian Ocean, IORA. So these divisions have to be over a period of time blended so that we develop a kind of a shared and common understanding of what do we wish to do in engaging the waters that we have. And the challenges here are among several, also in taking the focus exclusively on security and piracy to build developmental partnerships. If you notice, India's focus in last 5 or 6 years has been to highlight those components. For example, security and growth for all in the region, Sagar Initiative or Sagar Mala Initiative, Project Monsoon, then you have BIMSTEC. You have a lot of these initiatives which are now focusing on challenges and advantages of developmental partnership to be built in the region. And this region already has enormous potential and is growing rapidly. Most of the littoral countries are growing much better now. And that, I think, should build a stronger shareholder, that sense of kind of shared destiny in that sense, to see can they really multiply advantages by coordinating their focus on what can they do together. For example, Asia-Africa Growth Corridor is one idea where you're providing real-time information to people on the ocean. There are several similar things which could then come and be a network of nations to give each of them the niche area where they can have an advantage to contribute, instead of really contesting and then narrowly focusing on security issues, only sort of seeing each other as contestants, as adversaries. If you begin to shift the focus on enormous potential for developmental partnerships, which India is doing, and I think that will have its own challenges, but that is the way to move in the future, I suppose, in engaging the oceans.
Okay, all right. Time now to get closing comments from all my guests with the best way forward, starting first with the Ambassador.
Well, Professor rightly mentioned that the networks which exist in the ASEAN region do not exist, for instance, on the African coast. Much of the African coast countries are in turmoil. They are in situations one way or the other which relate to conflicts. Either the conflicts are still going on or they have been going on till very recently. Eritrea, Sudan, Yemen, even going further southwards. So India has to help these countries to make a turnaround wherever possible. And perhaps the Indian Ocean Rim Association is engaged in that task. It has set for itself certain objectives, and I think we are helping to do that. But it's going to be a long haul, and as the External Affairs Minister said during his valedictory address at the Indian Ocean Rim Association discussion, that there are still vast disagreements on matters of detail between various participants. So there will be a need for more dialogue and for greater understanding, but hopefully, it being the Indian Ocean, we have as India to play a central role in promoting a more holistic approach towards this entire region.
Sure. All right, Admiral?
All countries are coming out with their own visions, their own strategies. We had the US speaking about pivot to the east and rebalance, and then finally they started speaking about free and open Indo-Pacific and Indo-Pacific. And now in June this year, they have come out with the IPSR Indo-Pacific Strategy Report. ASEAN has cobbled together an ASEAN outlook on Indo-Pacific. China keeps on coming out with their white papers with respect to defense and with respect to South China Sea. Australia, New Zealand, Japan, everyone has come out with their own versions as to what they see and how they position themselves in this area and the maritime field, and what people can expect out of them. India, I think, also perhaps should come out with some kind of a white paper on Indian Ocean region. Now, given what the Prime Minister has said at the Shangri-La Dialogue in June last year, the statements which the External Affairs Minister has made during this recent Indian Ocean Dialogue, etc., you can see what would be India's position. But I think that needs to be articulated. That is one. I think secondly, we have to take responsibility and head an organic response to the challenges in the Indian Ocean.
Right.
You see, the smaller countries, they want maritime governance, they would want to improve their economic wherewithal, they would want to exploit the blue economy and the ocean economy, etc. But they don't want to be seen to be taking sides between this simmering competition between big powers.
Absolutely.
They want to have an equal say. And who can lead this organic response but for India?
Sure.
So I think India has to lead on organic response, and the low-hanging fruits are like human assistance, disaster relief, MDA, having an international fusion center, etc., etc.
Right, all right. And Professor, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
I think in Indian Ocean Rim at the regional level, we have to move beyond the simplistic stereotyping of friends versus adversaries. With each nation, there are going to be possibilities of building partnerships based on sectors. At the national level, also likewise, I think we have to focus beyond state-centric structures and look at who are the real stakeholders who should be involved in engaging into discussions. For example, coastal communities, the fishermen, for example, or scientific communities. A whole lot of people who are seen, business corporations, are not seen as partners in decision making. They have to be co-opted, and I agree with that, Admiral. I think world now expects India to deliver policy papers and white papers to articulate as to what it means, because on that will be based as to how other nations view us and how they seek to build partnerships with India.
Okay, all right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of India's World. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the